All right, so get ready because we are diving deep into utilitarianism today.
Sounds good.
You've sent in some truly great resources on this ethical theory, utilitarianism.
Yeah.
We've got like clear explanations, even a comparison chart. Excellent.
Awesome.
This isn't just some like abstract philosophy. This is a framework
Right.
that's been used to tackle some really weighty, real-world questions, and we're going to see exactly how it works.
Yeah, it really gets to the heart of how we make decisions, both individually, um, as a society.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. I guess utilitarianism is all about maximizing happiness
Yeah.
and minimizing suffering,
Right.
right?
Right.
It's about judging actions based on their consequences and choosing the path that leads to the greatest good for the
Yeah,
greatest number of people.
exactly. That's often called the greatest happiness principle.
Right.
And it was really championed by thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill.
Okay.
They were trying to create a system that moves away from abstract moral rules and focuses on tangible outcomes.
But doesn't that get really messy? How do you actually measure happiness?
Right.
It's not like everyone gets a happiness scorecard or something.
Right. Yeah, that's where the idea of a utility calculation comes in.
Okay.
It's not about literally assigning points, but rather weighing the potential benefits and harms of an action. You
Right.
see echoes of this in things like cost-benefit analysis and economics.
Oh,
For example, when a city is deciding whether to build a new bridge, they might weigh the economic benefits
right.
for commuters against the environmental impact and the cost to taxpayers.
Right.
It's about trying to quantify the overall good that will result from a particular action.
It's like a giant pros and cons list for society.
In a way, yes.
Okay.
And that leads us to different types of utilitarianism.
Okay.
There's act utilitarianism, which looks at the consequences of each individual action,
Mm.
and rule utilitarianism, which focuses on following general rules that usually lead to the greatest overall happiness.
So wait, in some cases, it might be okay to break the rules if it leads to a better outcome in that specific situation.
That's the potential tension between act and rule utilitarianism.
Okay.
Let's say there's a doctor who has a limited supply of a life-saving medication.
Mm-hmm.
2 patients need it, but there's only enough for 1.
Wow. Okay.
An act utilitarian might argue that the doctor should give the medication to the patient with the higher chance of survival,
Okay.
even if it means bending the rules of first come, first served.
But wouldn't that lead to chaos if everyone just started making up their own rules?
That's where rule utilitarianism comes in. It says, look, in the long run, we're all better off if we have consistent rules and principles
Right.
that we follow,
Okay.
even if it means making tough decisions in individual cases.
Hmm.
A rule utilitarian might argue that the doctor should stick to the first come, first served rule,
Yeah.
because having that consistent system ultimately benefits society as a whole, even if it leads to a less desirable outcome in this particular instance.
So it's like weighing short-term gains against long-term stability and trust.
Exactly.
That actually makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's talk about what makes this approach so appealing. It seems very practical.
Right.
It's about results, not just abstract moralizing.
You're absolutely right. Utilitarianism's focus on measurable outcomes is a major strength.
Okay.
Think about the public health movement of the 19th century.
Right.
The fight for clean water in London, for example, was a direct application of utilitarian principles.
Mhm.
By improving sanitation, you're maximizing the well-being of a huge number of people.
But hold on, there's got to be a flip side to this.
Of course.
What about those situations where doing what seems like the greatest good might actually require some pretty morally questionable actions?
That's the big criticism of utilitarianism.
Okay.
The potential for the tyranny of the majority.
Right.
Could it justify sacrificing the rights of a few for the benefit of the many?
Yeah.
This is where things get really complex and where the listener needs to start thinking critically.
I can see how this could get slippery if we're only focused on outcomes. Couldn't you justify almost anything?
Right.
Like, what's to stop a government from deciding that it's in the greater good to imprison a small group of people if it means preventing some imagined future harm?
Those are exactly the kinds of questions utilitarianism forces us to confront.
Wow.
It's not a perfect system, but it makes us grapple with some uncomfortable truths about the choices we make as individuals and as a society.
Yeah.
And to add another layer to this, let's bring in a completely different perspective, deontological ethics.
Ooh, okay. So deontological ethics emphasizes moral rules and duties, right?
Yes.
It's about what's inherently right or wrong, regardless of the consequences.
Exactly. Deontology flips the script on utilitarianism.
Okay.
It says, hold on, there are certain actions that are simply wrong, no matter how much good they might produce.
So if a utilitarian might be okay with bending the rules, like in certain situations, a deontologist would say, nope, stick to your principles,
Exactly.
even if it leads to a less desirable outcome in this particular case.
And you can see how this plays out in classic ethical dilemmas.
Mm,
Take the example of lying.
okay.
A utilitarian might argue that it's okay to lie if it prevents harm,
Mm,
but a deontologist would say that lying is inherently wrong.
okay.
Regardless of the consequences, the focus is on upholding the moral duty to be truthful,
Hmm.
even if it might live up to some short-term pain.
So it's about the principle of the thing, not just the practical outcome.
Precisely. Deontologists believe that moral rules are universal
Okay.
and should be followed consistently. It's about having a strong moral compass
Right.
that doesn't waver based on the situation.
Okay, so how does deontology stack up against utilitarianism in a real-world scenario? Let's go back to that engineer we talked about earlier,
Okay.
the one who discovers a defect in a product.
Great example. Remember, the act utilitarian might choose to quietly fix the defect.
Yeah.
To prevent immediate harm, the rule utilitarian might feel obligated to report it publicly. To maintain transparency and uphold ethical standards for the long term, now, a deontologist would likely say the engineer has a moral duty to be honest and transparent, regardless of the potential fallout.
Hmm.
It's about doing what's right, even if it's hard.
So even if revealing the defect could lead to a loss of jobs or damage to the company's reputation, the deontologist would argue that the engineer should prioritize honesty.
Exactly. Deontology emphasizes the importance of acting in accordance with moral principles, even if it leads to less than ideal outcomes.
Okay.
It's about the integrity of the action itself, not just the results.
You know, it's fascinating to see how these two ethical frameworks can lead to such different conclusions.
Right.
Even when you're dealing with the same situation, I'm starting to see why ethics is such a complex and debated field.
Absolutely. And it's not about saying one framework is right and the other is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It's about understanding the different perspectives and the values they prioritize.
Oh.
Utilitarianism emphasizes maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering, while deontology focuses on moral duties and principles.
Mm-hmm.
Both offer valuable insights into the challenges of ethical decision-making.
This is giving me a lot to think about.
Good.
It's like having these two different lenses to view ethical dilemmas. It's making me question things I might not have even considered before. I'm sure our listener is feeling the same way.
I hope so. The goal is to spark that critical thinking,
Yeah.
to encourage the listener to engage with these ideas and apply them to their own lives.
Speaking of applying these ideas, what does this all mean for us in our day-to-day lives? How can we actually use these frameworks to make decisions?
Well, for starters, it's about recognizing that different ethical perspectives exist.
Okay.
We don't all approach moral dilemmas in the same way,
Right.
and that's okay. The key is to be aware of those differences and to be willing to engage in thoughtful dialogue with people who might have different values.
So it's not just about having a toolkit of different approaches. It's about being open to understanding other people's perspectives.
Exactly, and sometimes the toughest ethical challenges arise when these different principles seem to be in conflict.
Okay.
That's when things get really interesting.
Like when you have to weigh the potential benefits of an action against the potential harm it might cause to certain individuals or groups, it sounds like there's no easy answer in those situations.
There often isn't, and that's where things like empathy, critical thinking,
Mm-hmm.
and a willingness to consider multiple viewpoints become essential.
Yeah.
It's not about finding a formula that spits out the right answer.
Right.
It's about engaging in a thoughtful and compassionate process of deliberation.
Okay, so we've got these two seemingly contrasting ethical frameworks,
Mhm.
utilitarianism and deontology.
Right.
But is there any way to reconcile them? Can we strive for a system that maximizes happiness while also upholding fundamental moral principles?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And it's one that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries.
Right.
Is there a way to find a balance between consequences and principles, between the needs of the many and the rights of the individual?
It's a question that really pushes you to think deeply about what it means to be ethical, both as an individual and as part of a larger society. And honestly, I don't know if there's a simple answer.
There might not be, but I think the process of wrestling with these questions,
Yeah.
of trying to find that balance, is what's truly important.
Mm-hmm.
It's about engaging in an ongoing conversation about how we can create a world that is both just and compassionate.
Yeah.
A world where we strive to maximize happiness while also upholding those core values that we hold dear.
This deep dive has been eye-opening.
Good.
It's made me realize how much I take for granted when it comes to making ethical decisions.
Yeah.
It's like I was operating on autopilot, and now I'm suddenly aware of all these different factors and perspectives
Yeah.
that I need to consider. I'm sure our listeners feeling the same way.
I hope so. And that's the power of exploring these ideas,
Yeah,
of challenging our assumptions and opening ourselves up to new ways of thinking about the world.
right.
The goal is not to provide all the answers, but to equip the listener with the knowledge and the tools to navigate these complex ethical landscapes with greater awareness and understanding.
So where do we go from here? How do we take all this knowledge and actually apply it to the choices we make every day?
That's where the real work begins.
Okay.
It's about taking these concepts and integrating them into our decision-making processes.
Okay.
It's about asking ourselves those tough questions. What are the potential consequences of my actions?
Right.
What are the underlying moral principles at play? Am I being honest with myself and others?
It's about being mindful, intentional, and compassionate in our approach to ethics.
Exactly.
It's about recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, but that every decision we make has ethical implications.
Exactly. It's about embracing that complexity and striving to make choices that align with our values and contribute to a more just and compassionate world. And remember, this is an ongoing journey. The more we learn, the more we question, the more we engage with these ideas, the better equipped we are to navigate the ethical challenges of our lives.
It's fascinating to see how these ideas actually play out in the real world. It's not just hypothetical thought experiments, right?
Yeah.
We're surrounded by utilitarian and deontological thinking, even if we don't realize it.
Absolutely. Think about our legal system.
Okay.
Laws against stealing, for example, are very much aligned with deontological principles.
Okay.
Stealing is considered inherently wrong, regardless of the circumstances. But then you have something like eminent domain,
Right.
where the government can seize private property for public use,
Mm-hmm.
even if it means causing harm to an individual.
Right.
That's a more utilitarian approach, where the potential benefit to the community outweighs the harm to a single person.
So it's like we're constantly trying to find that balance
Yeah,
between individual rights and the common good,
yeah.
between sticking to our principles and considering the consequences of our actions.
Right.
It's making me see everyday decisions in a whole new light.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that these aren't just decisions made by governments or large institutions.
Right.
We face these kinds of ethical dilemmas in our own lives all the time.
Like that classic situation where a friend asks you if you like their new haircut and you think it's awful,
Exactly.
right? The utilitarian might say, lie, tell them it looks great, it'll make them happy, and avoid any awkwardness.
Right.
But a deontologist might say, honesty is the best policy, even if it hurts their feelings.
Precisely. It's those everyday choices, those micro dilemmas
Yeah,
that really put our ethical frameworks to the test.
right.
And what's interesting is that we often make these decisions intuitively without even consciously thinking about utilitarianism or deontology.
It's like we have this internal ethical compass that's been shaped by our upbringing, our culture, our experiences.
Yeah.
But now, having explored these frameworks,
Right.
we can be more deliberate, more aware of the factors at play.
And that awareness, that ability to step back and analyze our own ethical decision-making process is incredibly valuable. It can help us to make more informed, more compassionate, and ultimately more ethical choices.
This deep dive has been a real journey. We've gone from defining utilitarianism and deontology to exploring their strengths and weaknesses, from analyzing real-world examples to grappling with those big philosophical questions that keep us up at night.
And I hope we've equipped our listener with the knowledge and the tools to continue this exploration on their own.
Right.
Because ultimately, ethics is not a destination, it's a journey.
Yeah.
It's a lifelong process of learning, reflecting, and striving to live in alignment with our values.
So to our listener, we encourage you to keep diving deep, keep asking those tough questions, keep challenging your assumptions, keep that ethical compass calibrated, and most importantly, keep striving to make the world a little bit brighter, one ethical choice at a time.
And who knows, maybe someday you'll be the one to unlock the secret to reconciling utilitarianism and deontology, creating a world where happiness flourishes alongside unyielding moral principles. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
That's a great way to wrap things up. This has been another fascinating deep dive.